Great. And this is just an informal, well, a conversation for the most part. It's not a formal debate, but we encourage you to respond to the others' comments. I think what we'll probably do is just have each of you start off by giving a brief statement about why you're running and why you're the better candidate for the DA position. And then we'll just jump into questions from there. So how about Mike, do you want to start off?
Sure. So thanks for putting this on and putting it together. Good to see you all in these times when we don't get much contact with people socially. Yeah, I'm running for district attorney because I think we need some major reform right now in our criminal justice system. I started my career as a high school teacher in the public schools of New Orleans, where I thought I was going to learn a lot about our education system, and inadvertently ended up learning a lot about our criminal justice system. My students, the schools in New Orleans, although we're post-segregation, are still very largely segregated. My students were almost all Black, which was a much different background, obviously, from what I grew up in. And I learned from them how they were impacted as victims of crime, as witnesses, as children of incarcerated parents. And unfortunately, a few of them ended up becoming defendants themselves. And you know, just what that does to somebody who's trying to learn, the trauma that they're coming from. I decided to go to law school. I moved to Portland in 2005 to go to Lewis and Clark, and decided I'd study criminal law, and I could be a person who got involved in the criminal justice system and be the change that I hope to see. Got a job interning for the district attorney's office in Multnomah County in 2007, hired on in 2008 as a deputy district attorney at the entry level, and worked there until 2013. And in that time, you know, I felt like I helped people, I did good work, but I didn't feel like I was changing the system by any means or fixing anything. You know, I worked on felonies, property crime felonies, misdemeanors, drug courts. I headed up a project to revamp how we got victims of crime restitution. Was pretty much the bulk of my work in the office. But in 2013, I got the opportunity to go to the Oregon legislature, and I worked for the judiciary committees as their counsel. And then soon thereafter worked for the Criminal Justice Commission, got extended an offer to work there and implement statewide justice reinvestment, which is really what kind of opened my eyes to both how you change the law and then how do you implement policies to affect those changes. And I think that's where a lot of the work comes in, is the implementation. I was appointed to be the director of that state agency, and starting January 1st, 2005, I've been the director ever since. In that time, we've done all kinds of major criminal justice reform projects, justice reinvestment being our largest, but we've worked on different kinds of options on how we could decrease disparity in the criminal justice system, looking at racial profiling across our justice system, looking at how we can do a better job tracking hate crimes, and really improving data and transparency across the entire systems. Some of the things I'm really proud of. That agency's grown remarkably since I've been the director, almost tripling in both budget and staff. And I think it's due to the good work and the realization by the legislature that this is a good investment in public safety. So when I saw the opportunity to run for district attorney, I thought, you know, my skill set that I've acquired, both having a background as being a prosecutor, driving a caseload, knowing what that's like on the front lines, but then getting out of the prosecutorial system and looking at the entire criminal justice system, and even broader, how can we interact with the healthcare system, the education system, so that the criminal justice system isn't frustrating goals across those other systems to get better outcomes. I thought it was an amazing opportunity. And the projects that I've worked on for reforming criminal justice in the state, I want to continue as a district attorney, both internally in the office and for the citizens of Multnomah County, and then also at the statewide level, because I think the next district attorney in Multnomah County has a huge voice in how our criminal justice system in this state can option, and that's an obligation of this role as well. So I think I'm the best candidate because I've been managing a state agency for over 5 years, overseeing staff, budget, implementation, major policy reform, major policy change in this state. And I'm a person who's proven that I can increase transparency in the criminal justice system. So I think that's exactly the type of leader we need as the next district attorney.
Okay, great, thank you. Ethan?
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here today, obviously. Running for district attorney, first and foremost, because I love this community. I grew up here with them, went away to school back with an eye toward public service. And for me, being a prosecutor has always been only a form of public service, but a form of public advocacy. And that's first and foremost what I see it as, a role that preserves and represents the public trust. And that's what I've done for the better part of over 2 decades now. So I started in the Multnomah County District Attorney's office in 1999. And I was there from 1999 to 2007. While I was there, I did, essentially everything that office does. I helped create the community court program, which has informed a lot of my views about the role crime plays in the community and public safety writ large. I handle predominantly robbery, homicide, gang cases, and I also revived the environmental crimes docket and handled a number of environmental crimes cases when I was there. I left that office in 2007. I went to the state's attorney's office. I've been a federal prosecutor since 2007. During that time, I predominantly handled national security and terrorism cases, and that includes both domestic terrorism, international terrorism, espionage, and counterintelligence cases. In addition to that, I've managed public corruption investigations. I handled violent crime cases as well. I think the upshot of my 2 decades of experience as a prosecutor is I've handled all cases, big and small, that have come through the federal and state systems in the District of Oregon, which has given me, I think, both relationships and a unique perspective into the legal community and the needs in the criminal justice system as I see them. In addition to that, I've been active in the legal community as the Oregon State Bar, on a number of other boards, and currently is the president of the Oregon Law Foundation, which helps fund legal aid services to poor and lower individuals throughout the state. And that also has informed my views on what I think the social needs are that are attendant to the criminal justice system. So that brief background, but I want to get back to, of course, what the question is and why we're all here, and that's why I'm running. I talked about the fact that I love this community, and to me, the question is, what does criminal justice look like in Multnomah County, and what role does the district attorney play in developing that and supporting it? To me, what we need to do a better job of, and what really drives the criminal justice system, is how we handle the lowest level offenses. The cases that are on the front page of the paper are important. I've been involved in some of those, but they don't impact people in the same way that theft, the shoplift, the stolen car, the burglary, the things we see a lot of that really change the way people feel about the community they live in, or the way they, I think at a macro level, view the community they live in and the problems they have. And I think that really, in my mind, should guide how we manage and really run the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. I think there are a number of changes to be made to the criminal justice system. It's not perfect by any stretch. I don't believe that the entire system needs to be dismantled and changed. I think in many ways, that's a viewpoint that doesn't really understand the nuance of Multnomah County or the system at large. And so for me, it's about fixing things in a way that best suits the needs of this county and who live here. And I think lastly, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, I think that criminal justice going forward in Multnomah County, and really my view and vision for the county, is changed in the last month. I think that anyone who, like Mike and I, who are crazy enough now to really endeavor to stay in the public space, particularly state and local space, has to acknowledge that the challenges ahead are enormous. And managing public safety and pushing it ahead in an environment where the budget constraints, candidly, are going to be far worse than I think many of us even want to acknowledge at this point as we just try and get through. That competing with the fact that the criminal justice needs are going to change and crime will probably go up. Those are acute needs that get me to sort of, I think, the tip of the spear here in answering the question. That's why I'm the best person to do the job. I don't come from a political background. My supporters are largely not politicians. I'm a professional. That's what I've done. That's how I've been recognized. That's who's supporting me. And this really is a job for a professional. It involves managing the largest group of trial lawyers in the state, who on day one will need the support and backing to try and manage the 10,000 cases that come through the system. And I'm equipped to do that. And I have support, and I want to do it on behalf of this community. And that's why I'm here, really, because of my feelings about this key and what I think it's with respect to criminal justice.
Okay, great. Let me ask you this question, Ethan, and then I'll switch it over to Mike. But, you know, after 4 years, I guess what, if anything, will look different about how prosecutions are handled in Multnomah County?
So there's the aspirational piece of that that I hope to achieve, and really where my vision fits in. And so I'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about the reality of budget constraints and what's happening right now. When we talk about what's different in 4 years, better job of managing that large number of low-level. What that means to me.
Sorry, wait, hold on just a second. You broke up just a bit. A better job of managing those low-level
crime. The prosecution, again, offenses. You know, the serious cases, the rapes, the robberies, the homicides will get done, and the right professionals handling them, they should get done well. The question to me in 4 years is, are we doing a better job of getting people through the system in a way that reduces recidivism and meeting the needs of the community? So to me, that looks like different things. That means an increase in community prosecution programs. I want to see a return to both community prosecutors and community policing that we really did a better job with, really from about 1995 to 2003. I think that this credibility and faith in the system, and does a better job of both prophylactically dealing with problems in the system and then triaging cases. The other piece is sort of, you know, making those changes where we need to make them. If there are best practices that we were thinking about 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you know, are we implementing? You know, I think there's an increasing awareness that changed since I started prosecuting about really where addiction fits into the system. And I, you know, hopefully we'll get to an even in 4 years in acknowledging and having best options for addiction treatment. But I think the last piece, and we're talking about years from now, it's going to be managing and addressing a lot of, frankly, the challenges we're seeing right now that will be attendant to the entire system in the next year or two. We're going to see a dramatic increase in domestic violence and child sex abuse cases, I think, in the next year because of the conditions we're facing now. Those are unique challenges. On the federal side, we're already beginning to see a number of different challenges with respect to COVID-19 related fraud practices, and I think that will change as well. Some discussions we can't anticipate. So on the one hand, it's that community prosecution piece I hope to improve and increase. And the other side of it is navigating the challenges we're just now beginning to see. And I'm equipped to do that, not knowing what they are.
Can you explain what community prosecution is? I mean, I think we have a sense of community policing, but what is community prosecution?
There are a couple different pieces to it. So the original model that Mike Shrunk put together really in the mid-90s revolved around of having prosecutors literally in the community. So there were prosecutors at the different precincts, and then that built around the community model that we created in the late 90s. And the idea was, in sort of abstract sense, to have community investment in the problems that were attendant to a given area. For example, we had a courtroom in the Brentwood-Darlington Community Center, and that dealt with crimes in the neighborhood in that specific town. And you had a DA out there who'd work with folks. And the reason that was active, and it was the most popular thing I think that Mike, he was DA, is because it not only, you know, reacted and addressed problems in a way that people felt their needs were being met, it also sort of preemptively dealt with a lot of problems. And I'll give an example, you know, because I used to see it. You would have neighborhood members or community members who would say, look, had a number of people squatting in vacant houses or drug dealing on a corner in a particular, you know, set of blocks in a neighborhood. You know, under our model now that really is born out of low resources, patrol cars would go there and make a number of arrests after a certain number of complaints. You know, that really is not an effective way of policing or prevention. Under a community model, what you would have really is a plan where the DA would work with police. Okay, we're seeing this at certain times on these days. What can we do prospectively to stop that? Are there a few key actors we can arrest? Are there, other folks who are coming in and out of the neighborhood? And this model works, I think, especially well dealing with, I think, what people perceive to be crime associated with homelessness in the city. And that's, has been, and I think continues to be our biggest social issue, leads into the system.
Great. Mike, how about you? What 4 years from now, what, if anything, will look different about prosecutions in Multnomah County?
Well, the good news about me running for this position and what the next 4 years will look like is I have a track record of taking over an agency. And so you can actually look at what I've accomplished and give you some ideas of what I can do to taking over a different agency. One of the very first things that I did at the Criminal Justice Commission was make all of our state criminal justice data transparent and available online 24/7 to the entire community. That's something that I want to do at the District Attorney's Office. I made Oregon a leader in transparency across the country. States come to us to learn from how we've done that, making arrest data available, making conviction data available, making incarceration data available. I want to make the District Attorney's Office one of the most transparent DA's offices in the country, the same exact way, making that information available to the community. And to me, that really kind of gets at the heart of one of the biggest challenges I see for this office, which is something that all law enforcement is facing across our nation, which is a crisis in legitimacy, and having the community believe that we are acting in their best interests on their behalf, that we are actively engaged in the work of decreasing disparity, that we are actively demonstrating that not only are we we're convincing folks we're making the public more safe, but we're doing it not just the way that it's always been done, which is the more prosecutions I can give you, the more safety I'm creating, but instead to actually look at what kind of charges are we filing, and then what is our outcome? What are we trying to accomplish by filing those charges, by getting those convictions? How are we building those plea deals? When I was in the office, we never used any kind of research to inform our plea process or negotiations. Attorneys, I didn't take any criminal justice classes before I became a prosecutor in terms of how to make things better. You take the criminal procedure classes. How do I talk to a jury? How do I do voir dire? All these different things, evidence. But you don't take, how do I create more public safety type classes? And so I think part of that is just the next DA's leadership and bringing that information in and plugging our deputy district attorneys into community groups and parole and probation who have been doing evidence-based stuff for a long time. So transparency, working on legitimacy. I think the other big change that you'll see is a much more community-focused office than it has been in the past. And what I mean by that is, one of the things, as painful as it is, I think, for Ethan and I to be putting ourselves out there as candidates and standing up and saying our ideas, it's a good process. It's a really good thing to engage with the community and hear from them what they want. And I think this is an amazing opportunity. The first time in really decades that this community's had a choice between two people that are not just the next in line internally in the office, but two people stepping up saying that this is their vision and this is what they want to see. And I've been endorsed by so many groups that have told me, we've never endorsed in a district attorney's race before. What does this mean? What would you do for our groups? So I'm very proud of the long list of community endorsers that I have. And I think what that demonstrates to you is that these are groups that I've been working with at the state level on reform, a lot of them. Some of them are new to this. But I'm going to continue working with them just as I have at the state level in the district attorney's office, and thinking about how can I work with the Latino network? How can I work with Apano and East County Rising? I've had great conversations about how those organizations, which are socially mobilizing in their communities, how can I bring an expungement clinic to the new facility that Apano has out on 82nd, so that they're working that into their networks and roots and bringing the community together and involving them in decisions in the office in terms of policies. So I think the first 4 years, really my focus is going to be increasing legitimacy in terms of the work that the criminal justice system is doing, making the community feel that we have their best interests at heart, we're transparent, we're working on the things that this community says are important to them, like reduction in disparity.
So that kind of leads into one of my next questions, and Mike, this will be for you. But in any DA's office, there's a lot of discretion in what gets prosecuted and how. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the principles that you would use and that would drive your decision making in those kinds of areas. And, you know, for instance, you talked a lot about data, and I guess I'm wondering, how do you take that kind of data when you're talking about a specific case? For instance, I guess if you can just kind of explore a little bit more kind of what's going to guide your decision making in how to charge it, whether to charge something, how to charge it, et cetera.
Yeah. So I think what my guiding principle will be is what are we trying to accomplish by bringing these charges? What is the end goal? And Ethan's absolutely correct when he says, you know, the 10,000 plus cases that this office handles, the vast majority are low-level misdemeanors, quality of life, so-called crimes. So when you take those types of crimes, what is the outcome that you are trying to get at? And frequently, the outcome that we tell ourselves we're trying to get is, I want to see this person engaged in treatment so that they're actually dealing with the addiction or the mental illness, or that they're getting off the streets and no longer houseless in our community, and we're connecting them with resources. So I think if you look at that is the goal of what probably the vast majority of what our prosecutions are in this office, you got to ask yourself, is bringing the charges, is securing a conviction for those charges always the best thing to accomplish that goal? And sometimes, of course, the answer is going to be yes, there needs to be accountability for criminal conduct. But sometimes having those convictions erects barriers in people's lives. And just a quick example, you know, I met a woman who was at an expungement clinic. She was homeless for 2000 to 2009. And she talked about the 20-some plus times she was arrested and convicted and sent to community service and sent to jail and fines and fees and all these things. And none of it impacted her behavior. None of it was the cause of why she got back on her feet and wasn't homeless. What worked was Central City Concern reaching out to her. And she was ready and she was at a place to accept that assistance. And then as she got her life put back together, then it was all of those penalties that the criminal justice system was putting on her for the last decade. That's when they were coming home to roost. So when she was actually doing everything that we would want her to do, she was getting clean and sober and attending to her issues, being housed, getting a job. Now the fines and fees are hitting her. Now the convictions are preventing her from getting her certification to be a CADC, a drug and alcohol counselor. So it's those kinds of collateral consequences and barriers that we're erecting oftentimes that I think the next prosecutor has to be really mindful. How I would use data, you know, as I said in the previous question, prosecutors, and I was no exception to this, you know, aren't really trained on, is this sentence going to change somebody's behavior? What is the evidence that says that this is what will work? That point was driven home to me by Judge Michael Marcus, who, when I was one time in front of him arguing for a 3-year prison sentence, he said, why? This guy's been to prison 5 times, and here we are again, and he'll be back here 3 years from now. Why? And I think that's the question prosecutors should ask themselves. I will and would love to see, and it's not been done before, but let's start looking at recidivism data by prosecutor caseload, by sentencing outcomes, by sentencing recommendations. And we have the data, it's there. It's never been looked at before. Now, will that be instructive? I'm willing to try it. You know, I mean, I think some of this stuff is we just need to try some new things, because right now what's guiding sentencing recommendations in the district attorney's office is this idea that every time we see you, we amp up the punishment more and more and more. And, you know, for some folks, like the person that I was in front of Judge Michael Marcus with, that wasn't working. We kept being in the same position over and over and over again. So let's start tracking and figuring out what is recidivism by caseload. So that's how I would use the data to actually see, are we increasing public safety or not?
Thank you. Ethan, how about you in terms of the high level of discretion that's available to the DA and his office, or in terms of what gets prosecuted. What principles or philosophies will kind of drive your decision making in the types of crimes or how they're charged, et cetera?
No, absolutely. And I think to have this discussion, we sort of need to start where the office is right now. Now in Multnomah County, that office uses about, I think, 10 to 12 different diversionary programs. And that is programs whose goals are to divert people away from the criminal justice system. And those range from in DUI to some of our lower level felonies. So we have different systems in place to do a lot of the things that Mike is talking about. And I think that's been a positive change really in the 2 decades since I've been in the system of acknowledging the different needs of the system. So that's the framework we have. Now there are a couple of rules to answer your question. Sort of what standards do we have and how do we approach this? I think the first is we need to have policies in place that set standards for when and how we prosecute people. And they have those in place and we need to refine them based on either data, resource availability, or the emergence of best practices. In other words, if we know that certain kinds of treatment are effective for certain folks in a way we didn't know 5 years ago. So for example, right now, I mean, this has always been the case for misdemeanor cases in that office, and those right now are about 5,000 of the 10,000 cases they handle. There are guidelines that determine whether or not somebody gets a violation, whether or not they go to jail, whether or not we pursue the misdemeanor. Likewise, for virtually every other kind of crime, robbery, drug offenses, property offenses, there are parameters. And I'll tell you, the tension in an office like that, and nationally, and this has always been the case, is balancing the need for pay amongst sentences with the judgment and discretion of prosecutors, judges, and the fact that no 2 cases are the same. I've always said the most important trait, or characteristic, or tool of any prosecutor is judgment. And any leader of a prosecutor's office is judgment. At the end of the day, I mean, there's always space within which to operate or to make decisions based on politics or collateral influence. Those decisions need to be made based on judgment, and that comes from internal management of the office. So I think to answer the question, you have a balance of guidelines that recognize best practices, data, and the resources of the system, with giving people space to work and make judgments in a given case. I mean, the reality is no 2 are the same. We shouldn't treat them the same. They're people. No 2 cases are the same. And you need to give space to operate within those precepts.
One of the things, actually, just to follow up a little bit on kind of what you're talking about, both of you have mentioned the need for programs to kind of really address the underlying problems that some of these defendants have. How would you, I mean, funding, especially, in whatever economy we're going to be heading into, funding is always a question. How would you go about ensuring that there are those resources? I mean, how can you expand that? What strategies or ideas do you have to make sure that there are those kinds of resources available for defendants?
You want me to start? Do you want my start?
I'm sorry, yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, so you've got resources at a couple different levels or issues. The first is staffing at the district attorney's office. There are as many prosecutors today as there were 20 years ago. So we start there.
Not as many?
Half as many per capita as there were 20 years ago. And that has been a long and continual drain on the office and the system. And candidly, I think this county commission has totally abdicated its responsibility with respect to public safety and community justice. I mean, the truth, need people to handle the cases. There's no substitute. There's no panacea that if you're more efficient, I think with data, that suddenly a lawyer can double their caseload. I've managed those lawyers. I've seen that office. I've looked at the numbers. I've been in a system where there are cases and you can see how it works on both sides of the aisle. So I see the resource issue through a couple of lenses. I think there are things you can do to try and get money into the system. I mean, hopefully if we have a new administration that frees up potentially federal grant money from BJA, that we used to rely more heavily on in Multnomah County, that can give you a couple FTEs. So there are grant opportunities, and there historically have been. But what I've also been telling throughout this campaign is there needs to be an advocate for public safety, independent of the county commission, independent of people who I think the district attorney office and public safety is, an unnecessary evil, as it were. And I'm really that advocate. I mean, people need to understand how these systems are related, and that if you divest in prosecution, that doesn't necessarily give you better outcomes on the treatment side. And then it takes all these things working in concert. An example I have is community justice is a key piece of this. We talk about these alternative programs, and it's good to have people, if you don't properly invest in, program in the management end, you're not going to get anywhere. I used to supervise the misdemeanor attorneys in that office, and it was much cheaper and easier to send people to jail with a stack of files, one after the other, than to have them manage a defendant or defendants who came through one of the alternative programs or community court programs, because it was just a resource-intensive process. And so I think the answer will see the district attorney making the case to the public why, relatively speaking, there needs to be more money in the district attorney's office in the community. And it's not necessarily to lock people up, but to do this right in a way that protects everyone's interests.
Mike, how about you in terms of resources, just expanding the array of programs that might be available to offenders?
Yeah, well, I think Ethan has laid out the challenges that the office faces in terms of the attorneys available and the FTE that the office has. But I completely disagree on the approach. Chastising the county commission, who actually controls your budget, and telling them you're getting it wrong is I don't think going to be an effective strategy at getting them to make an investment in the office. I run, as we've covered, a state agency. In my tenure as director, I started that state agency. We had about a $35 million biannual budget. It's now up to $90 million. And that's not a fluke. The way that we've done that is we've demonstrated to the legislature that for every dollar they put into the Criminal Justice Commission, they get a return on that investment. So I have experience doing that, but it's not only demonstrating that you can get a better outcome by making these investments. It's also who has always been in the back of the room with me when I'm in front of Ways and Means and defending my budget and asking for more. And that's the groups that I've already listed off, like Unite Oregon and Safety and Justice and Community Corrections Directors, and all of these groups that we've been able to bring together to say, making an investment in this office is a good investment and you'll get a return. So it's not about yelling at people or chastising them for their abdication of duties. It's about building those connections and getting them to want to invest into your office and do some things differently. And some of that is being open to what they want to see in terms of how the office, what are their goals for public safety? And how can the office align and make those connections so that we're pulling in the same direction and attracting that investment? So it's, to me, it's building those connections. And I think when you look at everybody who's endorsing me, because, not only is it the county commission, but there's money at the state legislature to make investments into pilot programs. In 2019, I fought for and got the legislature to invest $10 million into some of these cases that we've talked about, these low-level misdemeanor behavioral health cases. It's called the Impacts Grant, pursuant to Senate Bill 973. And so, I have a history of not only working with the county commission, who's completely endorsed me, but the legislators in the public safety sub of Ways and Means, the Ways and Means committee itself. And then the federal grants that Ethan's talking about are actually federal grants that I manage for the state as the state's administering agency. So I'm intimately familiar with the Burn JAG grants. And in fact, I am the vice president of the National Criminal Justice Association, voted on by my peers nationally to be the VP of that organization, which is the technical assistance provider for federal Burn JAG funding. So I can pick up the phone and talk to BJA whenever I want to talk about our federal grants. I know the folks nationally who manage those. And then again, at the state and the local level. So I think the next DA has to have those relationships and has to be able to build on those relationships to say, we're in this together. How do we achieve better public safety? Let's make smart investments that everybody believes in.
So Mike, let me ask you, one key group that has not endorsed you is the Prosecuting Attorneys Association. They actually recently submitted a letter to the editor expressing some of their concerns about how well you know the system to be able to make change. How effective would you be without the backing of the attorneys you would be leading?
Yeah, so obviously this is politics, right? And they have decided that, they're going to back Ethan. Change is scary. A lot of the things that I'm talking about are big system change things. I guess philosophically on some of those levels, the office isn't there. When I talk about mandatory sentencing and how I think that that's a bad system, the prosecuting attorneys aren't there. They're supporting Ethan. So I think that is it, right? I mean, change is a scary thing. This is an election. And like I said, this is the first time that the citizens of Multnomah County really will have two very distinct choices between how they want to see their criminal justice system run. I have all the relationships at the state level to make that change. So when I talk about sentencing reform, I'd say that as a person who was counsel to the judiciary committees, who's been endorsed by almost every single legislator that touches Multnomah County in any way. So I have all of those relationships at the state level to actually make legislative change. I've myself helped write and driven policy and statutory changes and implemented them across the state. So I'm well equipped and probably one of the best people in the state equipped to work on statutory change. Now, your question, how do I work with an office? Ultimately, I have a lot of respect for the men and women in that office. They come to work every day wanting to make our communities more safe, just like I do. And so we may have some philosophical differences, and they have expressed their preference for one candidate who aligns more with their philosophical differences. But, I also have faith that if the voters of Multnomah County were to say, the candidate that we think represents our vision is Mike, that they would respect that and that they would say, okay, if that's what the voters want, let's figure out how to do the business of the voters of Multnomah County, who is who we work for. And so then it's about, okay, if that's the direction we're going, how do we responsibly work on these reforms, implement this change, and move forward from there. So, I've got a lot of friends in that office. It wasn't that long ago that I was in there. I've been still having a lot of conversations with them. I'm not concerned that we wouldn't be able to work together going forward, but change is a scary thing, and I understand that.
And I'm sorry, Helen, would you mind if I just return to the budget for a minute? Because I want to make some points that I think are relevant here.
Sure.
So, Mike has done a great job Justice Commission and growing their budget. That is a distinct type budget than what the DA's office is. And, to my point earlier about the county commission, as I said, this isn't about yelling at anyone. It's about being a public advocate. And I think that's missing, frankly, at the city level and at the county level for public safety. The state has not given money to any DA's office to run its office, and nor do I see that happening anytime soon with what we're going to see, I think, in the next biennium for PERS. So it is going to have to come locally, that money. And lastly, I just want to say that, as far as building a coalition that can advocate for the thing that the office needs, a lot of these groups, Unite Oregon, PSJ, that have endorsed Mike, they are asking or advocating for cuts in the DA office. I've seen the questionnaire. So they're not looking to add bodies to people. And that's a philosophical difference. And I respect those opinions. But I think we need to be clear about, where the avenues are and what the prospects for increasing funding, if one supports that, district attorney's office. And I respect maybe different views if that's necessary. But I think we need to be clear about where that's going to happen.
Can I just respond to that briefly? The state actually does make investments in the district attorney's offices. They do it through the Criminal Justice Commission and the Justice Reinvestment Grants. Rod Underhill has deputies paid for by the state, as do many offices across the state, and also through our drug courts, where district attorney's offices get FTE from drug court funding. So, you know, the state is actually a very significant funder. Not only that, they also pay the elected district attorney's salary, which is probably not your point, but, you know, so the state is a funder and can be a funder, and will fund, you know, has funded pilot programs in the past as well.
Okay, let's turn to officer-involved shootings. And I kind of forgot where we left off. So actually, I think this might be for you, Ethan. Can you critique how the Multnomah County DA's office has handled investigations into officer-involved shootings? And are there any, is there anything you would change about the process?
So the format now for officer-involved shootings is in Multnomah County, all of those go to a jury for review. That's not the case in other jurisdictions in the state. That's a practice I would continue, having those go to grand jury to be reviewed regardless. In other cases, what will happen is the case will come in for investigation and be reviewed, and then a determination made if grand jury is appropriate. But in Multnomah County, you know, what I would aspire to do, in addition to continuing that practice, is try and add transparency to the process. I mean, I think there is understandably, whenever we have one of these incidents, a tremendous amount of frustration and consternation in the community. That's natural when you talk about the loss of life and you talk about the fraught history with law enforcement that often precipitates that. It's a natural reaction. So I think there are a couple pieces to it. I mean, the facts and the law are what they are, and that jury process is what it is. So unless you change the law with respect to use of force and officers, you know, it's not as if unless the facts are different, you're going to see different outcomes. But I think it's important to have transparency. I believe it's up in Seattle. There's a process whereby the investigation into the shooting, sometimes there's sort of a post-op autopsy of it, so to speak, where people get to see what steps are taken for the investigation. So there's transparency there. But I just want to say, and I've been involved in these over the years, you know, I think that with officer-involved shootings, we often are missing the real issue, and that is, and when there was, I think the last officer-involved shooting when Chief Outlaw was here, and both she and the mayor alluded to this, if we get to the point where we have officer-involved shooting, that usually means we have made collectively, or in law enforcement or in social services, you know, a number of mistakes downstream, or I guess upstream, in that, you know, failed someone on the mental health side. We haven't provided the right kind of training to officers. I mean, all these different pieces that get you to the point where something occurs. Pardon me. So, you know, I think we really need to think big picture, as someone who's worked on these and is very familiar with law enforcement, about what steps can we take to reduce the likelihood of occurring. I mean, I can speak about the process and the efficacy of the process, but I think really about what can we do, again, to decrease the likelihood of ever being in that position, because that's my goal, is to never have an officer-involved shooting.
And Mike, how about you? You want to,
yeah.
Go ahead.
So, you know, one of the things that I've called for is independence in investigation. I would like to see the Attorney General play a role or take on those investigations. I think, you know, Ethan's right. The law is the law and the facts are the facts. And so, you know, you're likely to get a lot of the same outcomes. But there is a perception issue that our community has, which is that, you know, the prosecutor's office and the police office, they work together every single day. They're friends. They play on the same softball team. Their kids play soccer together. How can we trust the DA's office to be the people that are holding them accountable? And whether or not the district attorney's office is doing exactly the right thing and doing exactly the perfect job on that, there's always going to be that inherent question from people in the community. So I'd like to see independent investigations come in and take those things on and apply the same law, apply the same facts that the current district attorney's office would do. But let's just take that one question out of people's minds and say, okay, an independent agency has looked at this, and these are the conclusions that they came to. There are some great toolkits out there. I've talked to folks from John Jay College who forwarded me on a toolkit for how a community can sit down and really go kind of at a, if you've seen an intercept model mapping way of doing things before, they do the same thing with officer-involved shootings. There's a toolkit that you could bring people from the community. So police officers, district attorneys, people who have had a loved one that has been killed, other folks in the community that are advocates for reform in this area, standing up for racial justice in other places. You could bring everybody around the table and really do a kind of a sim mapping exercise where you go through with somebody to lead that. And I think that would be a really healthy exercise for our community to go through so that everybody can hear everybody's viewpoints on where in our system there is opportunities to improve how we do this. So the good news is we don't have to reinvent that wheel. It exists. I've talked to some of the national people that do that work. And then just looking for ways to increase that legitimacy again by where possible, bringing in external people to look at it and make the decisions.
Okay, I'm having to slash a bunch of questions off my list, but I do want to get to ballot measure 11. Do you support and I'll start with you, Mike. Do you support changes or repeal of ballot measure 11, and what would you want to see in its place?
Yeah, I support repeal. Fundamentally for me, the issue is who makes the decision. I'd like to see that decision authority being restored to judges. I think that's how an adversarial criminal justice system should be set up. I think it's a little bit strange that we allow judges to make decisions on sentences for any level of crime until we get to the most serious cases. Then we no longer are trusting their judgment. And it goes over to the prosecutor's office to make those decisions. So I'd like to see a repeal of Measure 11. That being said, because Measure 11's existed since voted in by 1994, in place 1995, we're 25 years in to that tough on crime policy passing in the state. So there are some things that have been neglected. And one of the things is the sentencing guidelines. Let's look at our sentencing guidelines and see, okay, if these crimes are no longer Measure 11, do those guidelines still meet our needs? I'm also on the board of the National Association of Sentencing Commissions, voted in by my peers to be on that executive committee. And one of the things that I've learned from that process is every single state has completely different sentencing penalties for the exact same crimes. They do this exercise where they throw out a fact pattern, and they had each of us say what the sentencing outcome would be. And we all went around the table, had 20 different answers, and somebody leaned back and said, "Isn't it amazing? None of us agree, but we're all correct." So I think looking at our sentencing guidelines, they need to be revamped. Oregon's has one of the most simple schemes in the country, which does make us the envy of some of my peers for that. But I think ultimately having property crimes and drug crimes on the same sentencing matrix as very serious person crimes probably doesn't make sense and creates some false equivalencies. So ultimately, I'd like to see a new guidelines, or at least a revamped guidelines, if we were to get rid of mandatory sentencing in the state.
Okay, and actually, Ethan, why don't we go to you, and then I do have another question kind of related to this. But Ethan, do you support changes or repeal of ballot measure 11? And if so, what would you want to see in its place?
Well, for starters, I think we have to acknowledge that, the law is the law. So whoever is DA is going to have to follow Measure 11 as long as it's in place. So this is an important policy question, but as far as impacting the people of Multnomah County, it's going to be law until the voters say otherwise. And I do support Measure 11 with maybe a few changes or support of the existing changes that have been made. And I think in looking at this, we need to go back to the mid-90s and understand the impetus for this in the first. And that was a concern that I think is still valid today. The wide disparity between sentences and defendants for the same crime. And you had circumstances, I can assure you, having hundreds of these, and as one is familiar with the way the state system works in courtrooms, state and federal courtrooms, is that you would have a vehicular homicide case that got you a 9-month sentence in Multnomah County and 120 months in Coos County, and likewise for other serious cases. And I don't think that's right. I mean, you can sort of say aspirational ages should handle these. But the reality is we have mandatory minimum sentences in a number of crimes in the federal system. And the point of that is to recognize the inherentness of certain types of crimes. And in some we've got it wrong. I mean, I think mandatory minimums in drug cases, for whatever it's worth, those were largely a mistake. But I think with Measure 11 in those serious cases, it's something that is good. I mean, I think that there should be a floor to a sentence for rape, homicide, and the guidelines don't provide that as written right now, and nor would you get that with most judges. Now, related to that, I think we need to ensure that the wrong people are not swept up into Measure 11. Right now, there are sort of exclusions or escape clause in 37700 Ballot Measure 11. Ensure that, for example, lower level robbery cases, some of the other lower level person crimes, that folks are exempt from the mandatory sentences in Measure 11. I would be willing to look and advocate for perhaps expanding those to, again, ensure we don't get the wrong people into that framework. But I think for the most serious cases and offenses, it is why we have the criminal justice system and is a sound statutory policy.
Can I just say two things to that?
Sure.
So briefly, I think Ethan's right. We should look at the context of when Measure 11 passed, which was in the mid-90s. You know, crime was at one of the high points in our state and country's history. So I think that's important to recognize, and that the laws that we passed then in response to that, even though crime is now at one of the lowest points in our history, are probably not necessary. That was in response to a very specific context. And then the other thing I would say is that while there is and was disparity between how a different judge in a different county might decide those cases, we studied this in 2011. The Criminal Justice Commission wrote a report, and you can see that there's still a lot of disparity between how 36 different elected DAs handle these exact same cases as well.
Great. So let me ask you, I guess, in terms of voters, of what, Mike, for instance, like, a lot of things that you've talked about are significant changes to the existing criminal justice system from the prosecutors, just in terms of what the prosecutor would have authority for. Is there any reason for voters to be concerned that you'd be giving away too much? That basically you would not be kind of an aggressive prosecutor on various issues, and that that basically this would be shifting the pendulum too much to the other way?
So no, I don't think so. And talking about the different ways in the sentencing schemes that we would handle cases, it doesn't mean that we're not handling those cases. It doesn't mean that we're not still holding people accountable. On the lower level type crimes, the quality of life crimes that we've talked about a little bit, when I hear about folks calling the police because somebody is in their lawn or because a business owner is trying to get into their business and their customers can't get through, when I talk to them, it's not that they're looking for this person to be punished. They're not thinking to themselves, he really deserves 3 days in jail for trespassing on my property. They want the situation resolved. They want that person to get the help and the resources that they need to no longer be in that posture anymore. So I think thinking through, what are we trying to accomplish doesn't mean not holding people accountable, but it is trying to maybe transfer our way of thinking more into a problem-solving role as opposed to a functionary that just says, well, a police report came in, I read it, it meets the elements of this crime, therefore I must charge it, therefore I will prosecute it and get the conviction and then move on, and the penalty escalates every time. I think we need to be thinking a little bit more about what are we trying to accomplish. So no, I don't think there should be any concern about people not being held accountable. Ethan said, and I completely agree, the highest level crimes, we're absolutely, we're not charging those. Measure 11 is the law. That is the law that will be implemented no matter who's the DA, even if I think that structurally from a policy matter that those things should change. We're not talking about not prosecuting those cases or not holding those people accountable. But I do want to look at what are we trying to accomplish, and then recognizing and giving people some hope. And if they're doing all the things that we want them to do, they're attending to treatment, they've gone to the classes, they've successfully completed probation, how can we do things that helps get them back on their feet sooner, like expungements? Instead of making them wait 10 years, let's cut it to 5. Let's make that an incentive baked into every plea agreement that we do. So I think it is thinking proactively about not holding people accountable, but like how can we incentivize them and not erect barriers to their success when they are being prosecuted and then trying to reintegrate back into the community.
And Ethan, how would you assure voters that you have been a prosecutor within the system for decades. So how do you assure voters that you are a change agent, that you will be able to usher in some of these changes in terms of policies that recognize inequities in the system, et cetera?
No, that's a completely fair question. And I would say to those folks, look at my position and look who supports me and look at the credibility I have in the system. I mean, that what's unique about this job is at the end of the day, you are still running an office as a core vital function. It is not a policy position at its core. It's 75 trial lawyers and you have a statutory obligation to enforce the law. So I would say to voters, look, I know the system. I'm supported by folks in the system, and I know that there are things we could do better. I had an op-ed last week that talked about fines and fees in the system and the punitive effect on the poorest defendants who come into the system. And I know that those issues exist and that racial disparity, the chronic disease justice system, and there are always things we could do better. But to do those things better, you need someone who has the credibility backing of the folks in the system. Because at the end of the day, you're going to have to do the kind of work that people expect to be done and expect done well to move the needle on core functions of safety. And if you look where Multnomah County is now, I'm happy to say that it is further ahead of others, both locally and nationally, in implementing aggressive programs. And it has been really since the mid-90s. If you go back and look at some of the drug court programs, back then were cutting edge, now not so much because of that leadership. And I support those and would move those forward. But I think this is an important distinction that we need to disrupt and take apart the entire system. I think that sounds good. I don't think that in reality it works and gets us any further along in improving people's lives. And I do think, and I hate to harken back to this, but we are entering into a time of, extreme, I think, social unrest and economic challenge. And we're going to need someone leading this office who on day one has the credibility and the experience in the system to remind voters that they can go to sleep at night knowing that these cases will be handled well.
And I'm sorry, I didn't really leave a whole lot of time at the end. Amy or Therese or Noelle, if there was anything you guys want to follow up on?
No, you covered a lot of room.
Okay. All right.
Helen, I'm sorry, I did have to jump off for the corporate call for a moment, so forgive me if you covered this, but one of the important things that the district attorney's office does is handle public records appeals. And so I'm interested in the views of the candidates about the historical openness that the Multnomah County DA's office has had when approaching those and whether you would anticipate any change in that approach.
And Ethan, why don't you go first on this one?
No, I mean, I've always found it sort of an interesting piece of that office, the public records side, for whatever it's worth. No, I don't foresee a change in leaning toward a more open approach towards public records requests and managing those. And in fact, in some respects, we need to be more open in some ways as transit becomes more critical in different facets of society and sort of how we handle and lend credibility to the system. So the short answer is no, I don't see any material changes there.
Yeah, public records should be presumed to be property of the public. And obviously in Oregon, we have a lot of codified exemptions that the district attorney's office has to wade through when making determinations on whether or not a specific record meets the criteria of those exemptions. So I don't see any changes or departures in policy from the way that the current district attorney's office handles those. I think it's a very case-by-case analysis, but understanding that public records are they are property of the public, and so unless they fit an exemption, they should be released.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate your time today. I think that pretty much covers it. We will be issuing our endorsement close to when ballots go out.
Great.
Great.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Here.